work to get a really sharp knife, the main reason we do that is because we want to be able to work on reeds and we want to be able to play our instrument. It's not because we want to spend 30 minutes or an hour working to get the perfect edge on our knife. But there are a lot of variables to consider. What kinds of sharpening tools will you use? What kind of knife are you using? And then again, there's the whole issue of the technique involved. I'm Conrad from LC Double Reeds, and in today's video, we're going to be showing you exactly what we do to sharpen every single CHANG series knife that goes out to our customers. If this is your first time watching this video, I recommend watching it all the way through to the end to make sure you don't miss anything. But since this video is going to be in multiple parts, I will go ahead and put the timestamps up on the screen here and down in the description below, so that way you can quickly navigate to the parts that apply the most to your situation. For any hardcore knife sharpening junkies out there that are watching this video, we're just going to put the disclaimer out there that we are not professional knife sharpeners. We are simply professional double reed players that have this method of knife sharpening that works for us, and that's what we're sharing with you today. So there is a proper way of sharpening knives where you go in progressively finer and finer stones, which we call progressive sharpening. But it's kind of impractical because for us, as soon as you put the knife to the bark of the reed, that knife is essentially dulling right off the bat. So we found this method that works for us. It's going to get your knife sharp, quick, and get it to a point where it's really usable within a short amount of time, so that way you can get on to the main reason you're sharpening your knife, which is to make reeds for your instrument. So when you sharpen a knife for bassoon or oboe reed making, really the main thing you want to do is to be able to scrape the reed with the knife and have material come off. It is not 100% similar to the way you would sharpen a knife for, say, making food in the kitchen. Because when you're making food in the kitchen, you actually slice the food, whereas when you're making a reed, the main function is to actually scrape the reed. You're not slicing the reed. So one of the main things we'll be really taking a look at today is something that we like to call the burr, and how to establish the burr and get it to have the right feel in your hands as you're scraping the reed. Essentially what the burr is on the very edge of the knife, the actual scraping surface, you'll have a little almost hook type thing going on where you've sharpened it in a certain direction and use the honing steel to achieve that. What that does is as you scrape it, it actually catches the cane, and that's what's actually cutting the cane when you scrape. On a kitchen knife, on the other hand, you don't want a burr. You want it to come down to as fine a point as possible, so that way as you're actually slicing, it's doing its job. So there's three main things that we're really looking for when we're sharpening a knife, and these are the things we think about and the things that you need to remember when you're sharpening your knives. So the first thing is the thinness, right? Because we have to make sure that the actual material that we're dealing with gets down to a point where it's thin enough to cut something. So that's the first thing, making sure that it's thin enough, and when we're running it on a stone or something, that's really essentially what we're doing, is we're taking away some of this base material to get to the point where it's thin enough that it can cut something. The second thing that we want to be thinking about when we're sharpening our knives is the smoothness or the evenness of the actual edge of the blade. And what we mean by that is making sure that it is equally thin across the surface of the blade, not just in one spot, and making sure that there are no bumps or anything getting in the way. The third thing that we have to think about when we're sharpening a knife is finally the feel of it, and that's going to be essentially how we set up the actual burr. And what that's going to be is you can make it more or less aggressive in terms of the angle of the burr, if it's more like this versus more like that. And it's slightly different on a double hollow ground knife versus on a beveled knife. But making sure that we get the right quality of burr so that way it feels the way we want it to when we're scraping the reed. And this thing comes down to a little bit of personal preference, because some people prefer a reed knife that catches on the cane very aggressively. Some people prefer a reed knife that skates a little bit more as you're scraping. But it's really important to get this burr functional, because if it's not catching in any way, what you're essentially doing is you'll have to press. And that's one thing we want to avoid, because if you have to press on the cane while you're scraping, then what you're doing is, instead of removing material, you're actually just sort of compressing the cane fibers. And eventually, as you soak the reed and stuff, those cane fibers will open back up. And that's one of the reasons that we sometimes make adjustments to our reeds and those adjustments don't stick. So having a really functional burr that's actually helping you to remove the cane without having to press is going to be critical in making sure that you have a good quality reed knife. Now for our demonstrations today, we're going to be using our CHANG series Double Hollow Ground knife and our CHANG series Beveled Knives that we sell on our website, which is www.lcdoublereeds.com. Now we sharpen every single one of these knives that go out the door, whether it's a direct sale to a customer or going to one of our distributors that then sells it to a customer. And I would say we've sharpened well over 1,000 of these knives in the last few years. So keep in mind, the method that we're going to show you is what we use for these knives that we sell. You may want to adjust it a little bit depending on what knife you're working with. You may want to change to a coarser stone than what we recommend, or a different type stone than what we recommend, or you may want to use slightly different angles, or you may want to just experiment with the variables a little bit to find what works best for your situation. We'll also be making this video from the perspective that the people watching this might be new to reed knife sharpening. And because of that, we're not going to be recommending, 10 different sharpening stones that you need in order to progressively sharpen it to get, a perfect glass quality edge. We're going to be approaching it from the standpoint that if you had to go out and you had to buy, 1 or 2 pieces of knife sharpening equipment that you were going to get the best bang for your buck and actually see results, what you should get and how you should approach that. One of the biggest questions that we receive after selling our knives from our customers is, what kind of stone should I use to sharpen the knife? And it's a really complex question because there are so many different types of stones on the market. The important thing about choosing a sharpening stone, especially if you're only limited to getting one, is making sure that you have one that is coarse enough that you're actually able to remove material, but also fine enough that you're not going to be leaving yourself with a really rough edge. So at the time of this filming, the stone that we like to recommend to our customers, if you were to go out and purchase one stone, would be the Sharpen 1500 grit Japanese water stone. The reason that we like to use this stone is because we find that it gives us really good results within a short amount of time. It is coarse enough that we can quickly get the edge to where we want it to be in terms of thinness, but it is also fine enough that we have no problem getting a smooth edge. The actual width of the stone is also wide enough that it's easy to get full coverage of the blade without having to manipulate our sharpening technique too much, which we'll talk about that a little bit. In addition to the sharpening stone, we also highly recommend getting some good quality honing steel so that way you can really help finalize the burr as you're finishing the reed and make sure that everything's nice and smooth. And again, at the time of this filming, the one that we like to recommend to everyone is the Dickeron Micro super fine grit sharpening steel. Now this one's a little bit pricier than other ones on the market, but we do believe that it's worth the investment to go ahead and get this one. This is a professional grade sharpening steel. It should run you around the $100 mark to get this, but it would be a really worthwhile investment that should last you for years to come. But keep in mind, with any sharpening steel that you're going to get, especially for reed knives, especially for double hollow ground knives, you want to make sure that it's as fine grit as possible. You want to stay away from the ones that come with the sets of kitchen knives that look like they have little teeth on them and stuff, because that will absolutely wreck your blade, especially when we're talking about a blade as delicate as a double hollow ground knife. So whichever sharpening steel you decide to go with, make sure that it is as fine a grit as possible. Again, we recommend the Dickeron Micro super fine grit honing steel. So let's walk through the process of how we would typically go about sharpening one of our CHANG series double hollow ground knives. Again, we sharpen all of these by hand before they go out, and that also gives us the opportunity to check for any defects. And so typically when you first get your knife in the mail, especially if you order from us, this isn't one that you would have to sharpen straight out of the box, but these are steps that you might like to follow if you've used your knife for a while, if it needs resharpening. This is how you can get back to the same edge using the same techniques that we do. And again, this is a process which will quickly get you to a sharp edge. You're not necessarily going through all of the steps of progressive sharpening, but sort of following those same principles. It's a way to quickly get to the edge you need to efficiently make reeds and have a knife that you enjoy the edge of. So using the Sharpen 1500 grit stone that we recommend, the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the stone is nice and wet, given that it is a water stone. Now, the official recommendation with water stones is that you soak them beforehand, and that is something that I recommend doing on your first time using the stone. But if you're on a time crunch, you can easily just put some water on it, make sure that the water is evenly spread on the surface, and you should be good to go. So keep in mind that first process that we were talking about when we're looking for a sharp knife is thinness. So the first thing we're going to do is work to make sure that the base material we're dealing with is thin enough to get the kind of edge we want so that it will actually cut things. So starting with the front face of the knife down on the stone, this is the side that is facing away from you when you're actually scraping a reed. You want to make sure that you set the knife at a low angle, roughly 10 to 15 degrees. And we start by making sure there's even pressure down on the stone and making several passes while holding that angle steady. The big mistake that a lot of people make when they have a problem either getting their knife sharp or having a problem holding a steady angle without using a jig is that they're moving their wrists and they're moving their fingers during this process. It's really important to think about holding your wrists steady and letting your larger muscle groups such as your back and your arms and your shoulders do most of the work here. After you've made several passes, we can now switch to the other side. When you switch to the other side, you want to make sure that you raise the angle ever so slightly. By raising the angle a little bit, we're actually establishing that this is going to be the side that's facing you when you're scraping a reed, and it's going to start to establish that burr that we were talking about earlier. So again, keeping your wrists and fingers steady while letting your arms do the work, we're going to make several passes in this direction on the stone, angling the knife so that way we get full coverage of the blade where possible. After we've done this and we know that the edge of the blade is sufficiently thin, the next thing we want to check is the smoothness or the evenness of the actual edge. One way you can test this is by doing what we call the thumbnail test. Now you want to be careful when you do this not to press down on your thumb, because if you're not careful and the knife is sharp, you can actually hurt yourself doing this. So be careful. But what you want to do is you want to rest the edge of the blade on your thumbnail using only the weight of the knife. And I emphasize that, using only the weight of the knife. And then you can gently pull it, and you should be able to feel on your fingernail if there are any rough spots or spots where the blade doesn't want to move as easily as others. If you're finding that there are rough spots or there's spots where it's not as even, then you may want to go back on the stone and repeat the steps we talked about before, making sure that you have even pressure on the blade, so that way we can make sure that all those spots are smoothed out. Now it's time to move to the sharpening steel. Now when you're on the sharpening steel, the main function is to sort of finalize it, polish the blade, make sure that it's really smooth, and also to finalize the burr that we established when we were on the stone. I also just want to take a second to emphasize that when you're doing this step, you don't want to press hard on the sharpening steel. If you feel like you're having to press down hard on the sharpening steel to get the results you want to see, the chances are the blade isn't thin or smooth enough to begin with. So holding a steady angle, one of the things we want to do here is, again, make a few passes on the sharpening steel, making sure that we pull the blade as we do that so we get full coverage of the entire surface of the blade. And again, making sure that our wrists and our fingers are steady so that way we're holding a consistent angle as we do this. After you've made a few passes with gentle pressure, you can then change directions to the side that you want to finalize the burr on. And just as we did on the stone, you want to raise the angle ever so slightly, and you can actually increase the amount of pressure by a small increment as you do this. So make a few more passes, and then if all goes well, everything should be finalized. You can do the thumbnail test again just to make sure everything feels the way you want it to, or if you're ready, we can go to the last step of testing, which is actually scraping it on a reed. Now this part of the test is pretty self-explanatory, but it's mainly just to see that it's actually feeling the way you want it to when you're scraping, when you're doing the job that the tool was made for. You know, some knife sharpeners out there, especially when they're sharpening for kitchen knives, they like to do all sorts of tests, like how it cuts paper or how it, cuts the hair on your arm. But really the best thing we can do in our circumstance is just to try it on a piece of cane, because again, the function of our knives is to remove cane when scraping, not to slice a vegetable. So again, remember the 3 steps of the process. First, we're thinking about the thinness of the edge. Then we're thinking about the smoothness or the evenness of the edge. And then finally, we think about the burr and the feel. If you're not getting the results that you want to see, or if everything feels just a little bit wrong, you can go back on the steel or you can go back on the stone and try adjusting your angles and trying again. Keep in mind, steeper angles will give you a more aggressively catching burr. Alright, so on to beveled knives. If this is your first time watching this and you skipped to this section, I do recommend you go back and watch the section on double hollow ground knives, because a lot of the same concepts will translate over to beveled knives as well. So there's 2 main things that make beveled knives different from double hollow ground knives in terms of sharpening. One of them is the fact that the beveled knife basically has built-in sharpening angles into the design of the knife. And also the other thing is the function of the knife. So beveled knives have much better function in terms of doing heavy duty work, such as removing the bark layer of cane. And as a result, you may want a more aggressive type burr for something like a beveled knife, as opposed to a double hollow ground knife, which is mainly used for finer detailed work such as tip finishing. The basic process for sharpening a beveled knife starts out pretty much in the same manner as we did with the double hollow ground knife. First, you want to make sure that the stone is wet. So once the stone is nice and wet, the first thing we're going to do with the beveled knife is we're actually going to lay the flat face of the knife, which would be the face that's facing away from you when you're scraping a reed. You want to lay the flat face of the knife flat against the sharpening stone. And this is unlike a double hollow ground knife where you would actually raise the angle ever so slightly on this part. So with the flat face of the knife flat against the stone, make sure you have even downward force amongst all parts of the blade on the stone and make several passes this way. Again, the main function of this is just to remove material to make sure it's nice and thin. Once we've done this, you can change sides. You can either use the built-in angle of the bevel to sort of guide what angle you're going to use for this part. Or you can actually raise the angle a little bit further just to make sure you have a nice aggressive burr that's going to catch the cane as you scrape. Once you've been through this process, you can do the thumbnail test that we described in the double hollow ground section. You can do the thumbnail test again, just to check and make sure that there is a smoothness and evenness to the edge. And then you can move on to using the steel rod. So when using the steel rod for the beveled knife, the same concepts apply as when we use the steel rod for the double hollow ground knife. When you're using the steel rod on the flat side of the blade, you actually don't want to lay it flat against the steel rod. You do want to raise the angle just a little bit, and then with very, very light pressure, only really using the weight of the knife, make a few passes. And this is just to polish the edge. And now we can change directions. Using the beveled side of the knife, you can actually raise the angle just a little bit, again, just to finalize and polish and establish the burr that we want, and then make a few passes, making sure to keep your wrists steady so that way you can hold and maintain a steady angle as you do this. After this has been done, you can do the thumbnail test again just to check the smoothness and or check to see if the burr catches the way you want it to. And then you can move on to testing it on a reed once you're ready if you feel like you've gotten the right result. Now, I've personally always felt like beveled knives are a lot easier in terms of finding the right sharpening angles, just because a lot of it's kind of built into the design of the knife. But I do recommend experimenting with raising the angle a little bit on the beveled side to give you a more aggressive catch. So just as with the double hollow ground knife, if you went through these steps and you feel like you're not seeing the results you want to, you can either go back to the steel or the stone and try experimenting with different angles, or if you're consistently not getting the edge that you were once able to get, but now you're not able to get anymore, you may want to consider briefly moving to a coarser stone just to help remove some of that base material, again, in the light of making it thin enough before moving back to a finer stone. And I want you to remember those three things that we're always looking for. First, thinness. Second, smoothness and evenness. And third, then we worry about the feel and the quality of the burr. So, final thoughts on the topic of sharpening knives, and specifically sharpening our CHANG series double hollow ground and beveled knives. We specifically designed our knives to try to make them easier to sharpen. Especially with our double hollow ground knife, it already comes to a very thin edge, which it keeps for a very long time, meaning that in that first step of making sure you have a thin edge before you worry about smoothness and burr, most of that work's already done for you, and you don't have to worry about removing a lot of base material with these. The biggest mistakes that people often make when they're trying to sharpen knives, and the things that you probably want to look out for instance, are that people aren't keeping their wrists and their fingers steady as they're holding the angle on the stone. If you frequently find that you're having a hard time getting the right angle, or that you're putting it on the stone and moving it around and you're not really establishing it, chances are there's a little bit of looseness happening in your wrists. So that's one thing you want to look out for. Another mistake that people often make is that they start worrying about things like how the burr feels when they're scraping before they've actually made sure that it's thin enough to cut something and that it is equally thin and smooth across the surface of the edge. Remember that the definition of sharp, like we just showed at the beginning of the video, is something that is thin enough to be able to cut or create a hole in something. And that thinness is really key. So always remember the 3 steps you have to work in. First, make sure it's thin enough at the edge. Secondly, make sure it's smooth and even. And third, then you can worry about the feel and worry about the burr. If we start thinking about things in a different order than what we need to, then it just makes the whole issue more confusing, and it makes it easy to start, messing with things that aren't really going to help. The last thing is, knife sharpening is just like any other thing. It takes a lot of practice before you start feeling really comfortable with it. So if this is your first time sharpening a knife, it is going to feel foreign for you. Just imagine, the first time you ever drove a car and, there's these knobs and buttons everywhere and it seems really strange. And then after you've driven for a few years, it's like you just kind of go on autopilot. Knife sharpening is very similar. The best way I can recommend that somebody get good at knife sharpening would be to just go out and sharpen your knife 50 times, or even more than that, because the more experience you get, the more you will make mistakes. It's the truth. You're going to make mistakes. The more experience you get, the more you'll make mistakes, the more you'll learn from those mistakes. And over time, the better and more comfortable you will feel with knife sharpening. If you're using one of our knives and you're having trouble getting it sharp the way you want to, you can always write to us and we're happy to help out anytime. But we also offer a knife sharpening service, which you can find on our website. And basically what you would do is you'd mail the knife to us and we could set it back up to specs, just like when we sent it to you originally, and then we can send it back out to you. And if you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe. We are putting out weekly videos right now talking about double reed related content, so be sure to stay tuned and see what's next. So for more information on our knife sharpening service or our knives or any of our products, please check out our website at www.lcdoublereeds.com. And feel free to reach out to us anytime with any questions or comments. If you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment below if you'd like us to address that, and we will do the best we can. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at LCDoubleReeds. We really hope that this video was helpful for you. Now get out there, sharpen some knives, and have a great day. Be well.